Inflammation, it plays a central role in the development and persistence of many chronic diseases, but only relatively recently has the gut been linked as something more than just a passive player or affected reservoir for inflammatory processes. But what role does the gut immune system, and our own microflora play in chronic disease? We'll be investigating this and other questions today. You're tuning in to ReachMD on the floors of the A4M Conference in Las Vegas, and I'm Dr. Matt Birnholz. My guest today is James LaValle. Let me get it right. My guest is James LaValle. He's clinical pharmacist and nutritionist and CEO of Metabolic Code Enterprises. James has authored over 18 books on numerous subjects within the field of integrative medicine, and he serves as a course instructor for the George Washington University Integrative Medicine course. But perhaps most impressively, he also happens to consult with my beloved Chicago Blackhawks. Welcome to the program. Yes.
It's great to be here.
I would devote an entire interview to the Blackhawks consulting, but we have to get into some of the more meaty matters. So first, you gave a lecture called Inflammation Silent Fire, which focused on the gut immune system and a lot of elements around there. How did you arrive at that title? Silent fire.
Well, silent fire is that a lot of times when we think of inflammation, we think, oh, my joints have to hurt, or my muscles hurt, or my head hurts, or my ankle's really blown up and big, it's puffy. And really the inflammation that I'm talking about, and I think a lot of people now recognize, is that there are low-grade inflammatory processes going on in your body that disrupt everything from endothelial function, so the inner lining of the artery, to the blood-brain barrier, to kidney function and how we filter. And as we see people progress through their metabolic dysfunction, and this inflammatory cascade, this silent fire emerges as one that's fully raging. So no longer, after several years of silent fire, now you can say, oh my gosh, it's a forest fire. I can see the heat now, right? I've got an autoimmune disorder. I've got plaquing. I've got renal disease. I've got cancer, which is a consequence of chronic inflammatory signaling. And so it's a process that's going on over time. Initially silent, the longer it goes, the more it rears its ugly nature.
Right. And you put the gut as a potentially central player in all of this. But I think a lot of our viewers, our listeners, wouldn't go there at first. They hear inflammatory and they think the gut, they just think inflammatory bowel disease, and it stops right there. How pivotal is the gut? And maybe you can take us a little bit through what's called the gut-brain axis, because a lot of people don't even understand that.
Sure. Well, first of all, the gut is the connection from the inner world and the outer world, right? What we swallow, what we breathe, what we eat, what we consume has to be processed through the gut. And then there's different modifiers to that. So the drug therapy I might be on, if I'm on a proton pump inhibitor, or if I'm an H2 blocker, or if I'm chronically on corticosteroids, I alter that microbiome by influencing things potentially like gastric pH, for example. So you change the pH, acidity of the gut, and you change the way the beneficial flora grow, and therefore a different series of flora grow, and those different flora now create different signals for your immune system to play out. Most of it have kind of figured out finally, whether you read in Annals of Immunology or allergy journals, everyone's talking about the role of the microbiome and what the pervasive issues are when you start off with basically a dirty microbiome or a microbiome that's been skewed, and now we recognize that it leads to eczema, allergies, asthma, autoimmune disorders, including things like type 1 diabetes. If you haven't, over the recent few years, looked at journals like Clinics in Endocrinology and Metabolism, which is probably one of the preeminent journal revisions out there, we're all talking about the fact that the gut, and when the inflammatory signals or circuits get turned on in the gut, it leads to systemic effects like beta cell destruction from the islets of Langerhans, so where you can end up with type 1 diabetes. And so it's not so easy when you first think about it, because you think, hey, if I'm pooping regular, that means that I must have a healthy gut. It's a little more complex than that.
Right. And what is the chicken and the egg here when we talk about inflammatory signals? Are they coming from the disease that has already arisen, and that creates sort of a terribly synergistic situation in which the gut then and the microbiome contributes back to it and creates more inflammation? Or is it starting with the microbiome in many cases?
Well, I think that's the chicken the egg question that will never be answered, because the issue that we have is that, some people could start out with a perfectly healthy gut, but then they're put on several rounds of antibiotics. They get exposed to some bugs and they get put on antibiotics, and maybe they knock out their beneficial flora and some unfriendly flora grow back. Maybe you had perfect microbiome and you started eating foods and weren't digesting well, so maybe some foods that would cause more abdominal distension or bloating or changes in your microbiome, like eating a high sugar diet or a high saturated fat diet with low fiber, right?
Guilty 3 times over.
Yeah, exactly. No fiber, lots of sugar. And when you do that, you start to change enzymes that regulate how your gut flora actually detoxify things from your body. So sometimes the microbiome alteration is the initiator of chronic inflammatory signaling, and sometimes chronic inflammatory signaling due to, say, sustained stress, for example. You had asked earlier about, take me through the gut-brain axis. Well, when you get under stress, and stress could be psychogenic, it could be physical. I mean, I work with a lot of athletes. Used to work with the Blackhawks, not anymore, so I won't be as interesting of an interview next time for you. I worked with Julie Burns, who was the dietitian for the Blackhawks. But the point being is that you could skew your gut by being incredibly healthy, you think. And a good example of this would be you're a runner, and you hear of people getting runner's diarrhea, the gut-brain connection. When you run a lot, you create more cortisol. If you're under a lot of stress due to your workplace, or due to the fact you deprive yourself from sleep, or due to the fact that maybe you're using too many stimulants, which a lot of people are over-caffeinating. It's caffeination. Anything that would drive that stress response to the brain, the hypothalamus, the direct response is make more cortisol. The indirect response, which gets to the brain and then gets to the gut, is that the spinal cord signals for you to make more sympathetic nervous system tone. Make more epinephrine, norepinephrine, basically. More adrenaline, more noradrenaline. And that is communicated through the enterochromaffin cells in the enteric nervous system, the nervous system that connects the gut to the brain. So the gut-brain connection is real. It's not etheric. There is a nervous system that connects the two. And when you become chronically inflamed, you create a process known as neuroinflammation, where whether you're signaling from the gut and it's going to the brain, or you're under sustained stress, and now your brain is sending out signals of elevated sympathetic overdrive, which then triggers the mast cells in your intestine to now start to leak histamine. When everybody's looking at mastocytosis and chronic histaminic problems now, whether it's called cardiopulmonary issues or whether it's issues around the gut, that we have this excessive histaminic drive and that mast cells can leak histamine and create a chronic histamine exposure. And what does that boil down to for the gut? It boils down to the fact that the tight junctions of the gut lining, the epithelial cells, begin to erode. Because under an excessive histamine and excessive cortisol environment, the gut permeability changes, and then antigens that would normally stay protected within the boundaries of the gut now have an opportunity to present themselves through absorption, through the gut, into the bloodstream eventually, and then get an immune reaction. So now we're seeing, for example, Fasano's work at Harvard, gluten sensitivity, full-blown celiac sprue versus gluten sensitivity, and its effect on autoimmune disorders. And so it's really just this process that goes on that can be started from the brain, or it could be started from the gut, and quite frankly, it could be started from even blood sugar causes spikes in cortisol and alterations in epinephrine and norepinephrine. So you could be someone that just simply eats yourself into the situation of having a leaky gut.
Interesting. And what's interesting here is that in both depictions, as we talked about the chicken and egg scenario here,
that's right,
they both make a lot of intuitive sense mechanistically as far as impacts that would relate to inflammatory disease within the bowel. But you are saying, and others that you've been working with, collaborating with, and other researchers are saying that the inflammatory diseases, which in some way might hearken to the mast cell histamine release, the recruitment of inflammatory markers, your own immune system becoming an autoimmune process within the gut, it's not simply resigned to the gut. The gut isn't simply a reservoir from which all the damage happens. You're saying it actually has ramifications on other diseases, heart disease, fibromyalgia, some other diseases?
Cancer in particular. Look at irritable bowel disease and the incidence of cancer, right? Increased risk of colon cancers with irritable bowel disease. The other thing you might think about, it's the fact that it's kind of like this. If you had a car wreck and you saw the fender and you went, wow, that fender needs fixed. Colitis, right? We're talking about maybe an ulcerative colitis. Wow, that part of the colon is ulcerated. Well, what if it was failed brakes that caused you to have that fender bender? Did you fix the car when you fixed the fender? That's the equivalent. And think about it. How many people with IBS also end up with anxiety disorders? One through serotonin pathways, but they also have cognitive issues as it progresses because they have a neuroinflammatory process going on. So yes, there is a local effect, and then there's a systemic effect.
Interesting. So you had also talked about microbes as playing a role as, obviously they're not passive, but they're communication modulators or regulatory roles. Can you get us a little bit deeper into what that means?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with actually looking at probiotics and what's happening. And, as it turns out, we've got a lot of different probiotics that actually communicate in the microflora to do different things. So one family of microflora might control circulating endotoxin more and result in B-cell activation. Another family of lactobacillus, for example, may regulate how much L-positive lactic acid that your intestine is making to keep the pH of the colon corrected. Another family, so the Bacteroidetes family, when you're eating enough fiber, getting resistant starch, will communicate through making enough GLP-1. So it's responsible for signaling glucagon-like peptide is an intestinal hormone. And the microflora are literally playing the symphony of brain hormone regulation that does things like regulate leptin and ghrelin for appetite, improve the modeling of glucagon and glucose regulation, and then play important roles in gamma delta cell expression for, say, fighting off colds and flu, working with detoxification of hormones that your body makes hormones. You got to get rid of them after you make them, and if you don't have enough of the beneficial flora that are making glucuronides, right? You get beta glucuronide. Glucuronides get attached to a hormone. If you don't have the right flora, you have unfriendly flora, you make more beta glucuronidase, which cleaves the phase 2 conjugate off of that hormone and allows it to recircle again, and then recirculate it gets absorbed and then stored, and then you start to get into all kinds of these hormonal pattern abnormalities. And I just don't think we have enough. We're still understanding the microbiome. It'd be great if we could just say, oh, you know what, we understand what all 500 of these do in concert. Turns out it's probably different with regionality, nationality, and cultural foods as to what your flora is doing so that you're resilient to the local stressors and threats to you, which I think is pretty cool.
I would hasten to agree with you. If you're just joining us, this is ReachMD. I'm Dr. Matt Birnholz. We're at the A4M meeting in Las Vegas, and I'm joined by James LaValle. We're talking about the microbiome's influence on chronic disease and disease development and management. So you raised a really interesting point there. I wanted to get into some therapeutic approaches, ways of
Sure.
perceiving how we can move forward in terms of helping people with this. But
Of course.
why is it that we don't see, or do we, maybe I'm misconceived on this, why don't we see, based on nutritional choices from different parts of the world, cultural practices therein, why don't we see very, very different spectra of inflammatory disease? Or maybe you can correct me right now, do we?
Oh, yeah, I think we do see differences. I think, for example, real high incidences of type 2 diabetes in India and China. Lots of carbohydrates that are eaten there. And when you eat a very high, rich carbohydrate diet, you're going to influence your microflora again. And so I think that there are changes. There are some patterns. We don't have the same incidences of diabetes and cancer and heart disease everywhere across the world. And I'm not here to tell you that it's because of the microflora, but I would say that if the gut flora is not healthy, then you're certainly predisposing someone to a chronic inflammatory process that ends up expressing itself probably because of their genetic, genomic, and environmental predisposition that they present when the inflammatory match, so to speak, is struck and that silent inflammation and, rears its ugly head, right? So the table is set through genetics, diet, exercise frequency, environmental exposure, drug history, all these things, emotional stress. Then the influencing inflammation kind of weaves its way through that discord of the genomics, proteomics and metabolome to create expression of disease. The amalgamation occurs when we amalgamate our diet, right? As we've seen, Western culture diet, diabetes goes up.
Right. And it seems many people would have associated the rise in diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome across other parts of the world as being related to the westernization and induction of a lot of diets from the U.S. over to other parts of the world. You mentioned China and India. It's no surprise that they've had a massive upswing in utilization of things like McDonald's and other chains.
Right.
So perhaps that plays a role here.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, look, fast food problems are fast food problems, and globalization of fast food is an issue. And it's, when you really look at it, if you boil down kind of from the macronutrient perspective, if you look at all the data sets in the United States, it's real simple. We eat way too much starch and way too much sugar. And I don't care whether it's healthy starch. Oh, I'm going to eat gluten-free. I'm going to eat, okay, you're eating gluten-free. You still shouldn't eat a box of gluten-free cookies, even though they're gluten-free. Or I'm going to start juicing. So now you drink 16 ounces of fruit juice. So you're getting all that fructose loading, which without a doubt contributes more to any other thing that I know right now of influencing insulin receptor sensitivity and subsequent insulin resistance. Just keep drinking tons and tons of fruit juice. And the next piece to that would be, of course, is that, look, traditional cultures like India, I really believe it's just, look, they eat a lot of rice and they eat a lot of starch. And so they have a high incidence, of diabetes. And once again, we have to move back from thinking that there's a single cause and begin to understand that your metabolism, where we sit today, our metabolism is the sum total of everything that's happened from the time we were in our mother's womb, the epigenetics, and all the subsequent expressions of who we are today. And that creates and dictates how inflamed I am today and whether I'm developing a disease or how good I feel. And more importantly, our metabolic output today, meaning all the markers that we measure in blood, urine, saliva, quality of life surveys, biometrics, okay, we got all that stuff down. And the sum total of that is really dictating where you're going to end up. The elegance comes, it's easy to pick up somebody with irritable bowel disease. It's a lot harder to find somebody who's pre-irritable bowel disease and help them to make lifestyle choices that will then change their life and maybe thwart that expression.
Right. So if we, in just the last couple of minutes, if we spend a little bit of more invested thought on that therapeutic approach,
sure.
Getting ahead of that for patients.
Absolutely.
Does it come down primarily to nutritional guidance, or are there other more aggressive means? We hear of stool transplants. We hear of a number of other things that can help try to modify our microbiome if this will have a noted effect for people's health, whether it be inflammatory disease or otherwise. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, there's everything from the more heroic, things like stool transplants, which, obviously, have been very successful. There's been some very interesting trials that have been developed. But, I've been doing this work 32 years. So I started doing nutrition education for people, teaching them how to eat in 1986. And so I find that a lot of people, the first thing they have to do is learn how to love vegetables. Hug your broccoli and cauliflower, and I'm not kidding. People do not eat enough plant food. The recommended amount is 12 cups a day of fruits and vegetables. And what I tell people is 3 times vegetables over fruit. And you think that's really simple. It's not that simple, because the more insulin resistant people get, the less efficient their cells are at making energy, and they need the starch and the sugar. So you have to repair their energy production. But the first step is fiber, vegetables. If you're not digesting them well, eat them cooked. That'll help you to digest them. The next step is I'm probably going to need to replace the microbiome, because if I've eaten poorly, been on a lot of antibiotics, I'm under stress and not sleeping well, I've created a lot of cortisol, I've released a lot of histamine, I've got a bad pH most likely in my localized gut, and I should probably try to seed the gut with some beneficial flora. And pick the flora, look for probiotics that have human trials on them. I don't really see too many rats coming in my practice. If I did, there'd be a million things to give people, both on the drug side and on the plant side. So look for those floras that have great evidence and compelling evidence that they benefit and restore immunologic drive. And the third thing, of course, would be, which a lot of people forget about, you really have to dig into the stress response. It's easy for me to tell you, oh yeah, use nystatin if you're suspecting candida. Let's start asking people to stick their tongue out again if they have thrush instead of looking at a piece of a lab sheet. Let's do a physical exam. They have fungus growing on them. If they got fungus growing on them, they probably got fungus growing in them, right? That's what it's not a big surprise. But it's the nuances that I think are important. You could do corrective action for the gut for the rest of your life, and if you did not correct for the excessive hypothalamic stress response, which is driving cortisol and driving histamine release. In other words, getting people to calm down, slow down, deep breathe, make it a part of their life. You're going to always be chasing your tail trying to correct the microbiome because you're just literally having problems with getting counter correction. And so it's important that people understand that lifestyle piece of integrative medicine, it plays a physiologic role in someone's health. It's just not that, oh, exercise is good for you, or oh, eating right is good for you. It's that they're playing a physiologic role in modulating the neurochemicals of inflammation and normalizing the microbiome for the individual that's been skewed.
I couldn't have generated better closing comments myself. I wish I could ask you about 10 more questions, but I think we have, unfortunately, run out of time. I do want to thank my guest, James LaValle. He is clinical pharmacist, nutritionist, author of many, many books, and probably the biggest reason why the Blackhawks won 3 out of 6 years in a row.
Julie Burns is the biggest reason. I just helped.
So I just thank him profusely for that, and Julie Burns by extension. This is ReachMD. I'm Dr. Matt Birnholz. For access to this and other podcasts, come over to reachmd.com, and we'll see you there. Thanks again, James.